A man dressed as Elvis walked into a packed auditorium, and every single person in that room laughed at him. 90 minutes later, those same people were crying. It's 2001, Tupelo, Mississippi. The Elvis Presley Birthplace Museum is hosting its annual tribute festival. This is the town where Elvis was born, where he grew up dirt poor, where he first opened his mouth to sing in a tiny Assembly of God church and made grown adults stop mid-prayer to listen. Every year, dozens of Elvis tribute artists descend on this town. They come from all over. Memphis, Nashville, Dallas. Some fly in from as far as London and Tokyo. They wear the jumpsuits. They do the lip curl. They slick their hair back and practice the karate moves and belt out suspicious minds in hotel bathrooms at 2 in the morning. It's a big deal. The competition is real. There are judges. There are prizes. And there is a crowd of die-hard Elvis fans who know every song, every movie, every concert, every documented moment of this man's life. You cannot fool these people. They have spent decades studying the king, and they can spot a fraud from the back row of a 2,000-seat auditorium. Which is exactly what they thought they were looking at when a man named Gerald Watkins walked out onto that stage. And what happened over the next hour and a half became one of the most talked-about moments in the history of Elvis tribute culture. A moment that nobody recorded in full, that no major outlet covered at the time, and that only survived because the people who were there couldn't stop talking about it for the next 20 years. If you love stories about underdogs who silence every doubter in the room, the kind of stories that give you actual chills, you're going to want to stay for this one. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because this channel exists to tell you the stories that history almost forgot. Let me start from the beginning. Gerald Watkins was 53 years old in the summer of 2001. He lived in Meridian, Mississippi, about 90 miles southeast of Tupelo. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a textile plant. Monday through Friday, 7 to 4, he fixed machines that made fabric. That was his job. That was his life, at least the part the world could see. Gerald was not a performer. He had never entered a competition of any kind. He had never sung in front of a crowd larger than maybe 30 people at his church. He didn't have a manager. He didn't have headshots. He didn't have a website, which in 2001, not everyone did, but serious tribute artists absolutely did. What Gerald had was a voice. Not a voice like Elvis. Not a voice that reminded you of Elvis. A voice that, when you closed your eyes and listened, made you genuinely question whether you were hearing a living man or a ghost. His wife, Claudette, had been telling him this for 25 years. His friends at church had been telling him. His coworkers, the ones who'd caught him singing while calibrating machinery, had been telling him. Everyone who heard Gerald Watkins sing told him the same thing. You sound exactly like him, exactly. And Gerald would smile and shake his head and change the subject, because Gerald Watkins did not think of himself as a performer. He thought of himself as a man who loved Elvis Presley's music the way some people love breathing. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't an obsession. It was woven into who he was at a molecular level. Gerald first heard Elvis when he was 6 years old, 1954. His older cousin had a radio, and one afternoon, "That's All Right" came crackling through the speaker, and Gerald sat on the floor of his cousin's bedroom and didn't move for 3 minutes and 12 seconds. He later said it was the first time he understood that sound could physically change how your body felt, like the music reached inside his chest and rearranged something. From that day forward, Gerald studied Elvis the way a doctoral student studies a dissertation topic. He didn't just listen. He deconstructed. He learned how Elvis breathed between phrases. He learned where Elvis placed vibrato and where he deliberately withheld it. He learned the micro-timing, the way Elvis would land on a beat just a fraction behind where you expected, creating a pull, a gravity that made you lean forward without knowing why. He taught himself guitar by slowing down Elvis records on a turntable and matching his fingers to the sounds. He learned piano by ear in the fellowship hall of his church, staying late after Wednesday night services to practice on the old upright that nobody else ever touched. But he never performed, not really, not publicly. For 47 years, Gerald Watkins kept this extraordinary gift almost entirely to himself. Until Claudette entered him in the Tupelo tribute competition without telling him. Claudette Watkins was, by all accounts, a woman of decisive action and limited patience for what she called foolishness. And in her view, the most foolish thing her husband had ever done was refuse to let anyone hear what God had clearly given him. She'd been pushing him for years, gently at first, then not gently, then with the kind of persistent, loving pressure that only a spouse of 2 decades can apply. Gerald always said no. He was too old. He wasn't a professional. He'd embarrass himself. He didn't have a costume. That last excuse was the one Claudette dismantled first. In the spring of 2001, she drove to a costume shop in Jackson, Mississippi, and bought a white jumpsuit. Not a good one. Not a custom-made, rhinestone-studded, leather-belted replica. A cheap polyester jumpsuit that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd had Elvis described to them over the phone. The rhinestones were plastic. The cape was made of what appeared to be shower curtain material. The belt buckle was spray-painted gold and was already peeling. It cost her $37. She hid it in the trunk of her car for 2 months. Then, without saying a word to Gerald, she filled out the registration form for the Tupelo Elvis Festival tribute competition. She paid the $40 entry fee with money she'd saved from her grocery budget. She forged his signature, which, she later admitted with absolutely no remorse, was something she'd gotten very good at over the years. When she finally told Gerald what she'd done, 3 weeks before the event, the man didn't speak to her for 2 full days. On the 3rd day, he came downstairs, sat across from her at the kitchen table, and said, "If I'm doing this, I need you to press that jumpsuit." Claudette smiled. She'd already pressed it. The Tupelo Elvis Festival drew serious tribute artists. I need you to understand what serious means in this context. These were men who spent thousands of dollars on custom jumpsuits hand-sewn by the same tailors who made costumes for Las Vegas shows. They had professionally styled wigs, though most of them would deny they were wigs. They traveled with backup bands. Some of them had choreographers. One competitor from Dallas had a lighting designer who traveled with him. They rehearsed for months. They studied video footage frame by frame. They had vocal coaches. They had fan clubs. Some of them made a full-time living doing this, performing at casinos, county fairs, corporate events, private parties. For them, the Tupelo competition was the Super Bowl. It was where you proved you were the best in the business. So when Gerald Watkins walked into the registration area on the morning of the competition, carrying his costume in a plastic grocery bag, wearing khaki pants and a short-sleeve button-down shirt that said Delta Textiles on the pocket, the reaction was immediate. People stared, not the curious, neutral stare you give a stranger, the kind of stare that contains a complete assessment and a verdict. A few of the other tribute artists looked him up and down, and then looked at each other with expressions that communicated everything without a single word being spoken. Who is this guy? A man named Ricky Valent, who had won the competition twice before and was considered the heavy favorite that year, was standing near the check-in table when Gerald approached. Ricky was already in partial costume. His jumpsuit was custom-made in Nashville. It had over 3,000 handset Swarovski crystals. His hair was immaculate. Gerald introduced himself quietly. "I'm Gerald. I'm here to register. Well, my wife registered me. I'm just here to show up, I suppose." Ricky looked at the plastic grocery bag. "Is your costume in there?" "Yes, sir." Ricky nodded slowly. "Good luck, brother," he said, in a tone that carried exactly zero expectation that luck would be necessary or useful. A woman working the registration table later told a local reporter that she almost asked Gerald if he was sure he was at the right event. "He looked like somebody's uncle who'd wandered in looking for the bathroom," she said. "I felt bad for him before he even opened his mouth." When Gerald emerged from the changing area in his $37 jumpsuit, the laughter began. Not cruel laughter, not at first. It was the suppressed, uncomfortable laughter of people who are witnessing something they find painfully awkward and don't know where to look. A few of the other tribute artists openly smirked. One of them, a man Gerald never identified by name, said just loud enough to be heard, "Did Halloween come early?" Gerald heard it. Of course he heard it. And according to Claudette, who was sitting in the 3rd row gripping her purse like it owed her money, Gerald's face went completely blank. Not hurt, not angry, blank. Like he'd pulled a curtain down behind his eyes, and whatever was happening behind it was nobody's business but his. The audience was large, about 1,200 people. The auditorium was the Tupelo Civic Auditorium, a venue that held deep significance for Elvis fans because it was where a 10-year-old Elvis had performed at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair in 1945. This was hallowed ground, and the people filling those seats knew their Elvis. When the MC announced Gerald's name, the applause was polite but thin. The kind of applause you give because you were raised with manners, not because you have expectations. Several people in the audience later admitted they were already looking at the program to see who was performing next. Gerald walked to center stage. The house band, a group of professional musicians who backed all the competitors, watched him approach with carefully neutral expressions. The bandleader, a guitarist named Marcus Hall, leaned over to his bass player and whispered, "Keep it simple. Follow his lead. If he's lost, just vamp in E." They were preparing for a disaster. Gerald stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted it slightly. He looked out at 1,200 faces that expected nothing from him. He looked down at the cheap jumpsuit with its peeling belt buckle and plastic rhinestones. He took a breath. And then, without any introduction, without any preamble, without a single word spoken, Gerald Watkins began to sing. He opened with an American trilogy. For those who don't know, this is widely considered one of the most vocally demanding songs in Elvis's entire catalog. It's a medley of 3 songs: Dixie, the battle hymn of the Republic, and All My Trials, arranged into a single sweeping epic that requires a singer to navigate quiet, tender passages and massive, soaring crescendos, sometimes within the same verse. It is the vocal equivalent of climbing Everest. Most tribute artists won't touch it. The ones who do usually save it for the end of their set, after they've warmed up. Gerald Watkins opened with it. The first note came out and the auditorium shifted, not gradually, instantly. Like someone had changed the channel on reality, the conversation stopped. The rustling programs went still. The people who had been looking at their watches or checking who was performing next snapped their heads toward the stage. Because this wasn't an imitation. This wasn't someone doing a good Elvis impression. This was something else entirely. Gerald's voice had the same weight as Elvis's voice. The same depth in the lower register, that rich baritone that felt like it was coming from somewhere beneath the floor. But it also had Elvis's agility. The ability to move from a whisper to a roar without any audible shift in technique, as if the voice simply expanded to fill whatever emotional space the song demanded. Marcus Hall, the bandleader, later said his hands almost stopped moving on the guitar strings. "I've backed hundreds of tribute artists," he said. "Hundreds. Some of them are very, very good. This man was not a tribute artist. I don't know what he was, but that word doesn't cover it. When he started singing, I forgot I was in a competition. I forgot I was on a stage. I was just listening like everyone else. I've never had that experience before or since." By the time Gerald reached the crescendo of Battle Hymn of the Republic, the section where the voice has to climb, and then hold at a peak that feels almost impossibly sustained, something extraordinary was happening in the audience. People were crying. Not 1 or 2 sensitive souls. Dozens of people. Men and women, young people and old people. Lifelong Elvis fans who had heard every recording, attended concerts, watched every special, people who thought they had heard everything there was to hear. A woman named Patricia Hernandez, who had driven up from Mobile, Alabama with her mother, described it like this: "My mama saw Elvis live in 1974. She talked about it for the rest of her life. When this man started singing, my mama grabbed my hand so hard it hurt, and she said, 'Patty, he's here. He's right here.'" She wasn't confused. She wasn't senile. She knew where she was. She just couldn't reconcile what she was hearing with the fact that Elvis Presley died in 1977. Gerald performed for 22 minutes. After an American trilogy, he did If I Can Dream. Then How Great Thou Art. Then, to close, Can't Help Falling in Love. He didn't do karate moves. He didn't do the lip curl. He didn't shake his hips or strike poses. He stood at that microphone in that ridiculous $37 jumpsuit with its peeling belt buckle, and he sang with a purity of intention that stripped away every layer of spectacle and left nothing but the music. When the last note of Can't Help Falling in Love faded, there was silence. Not the silence of an underwhelmed audience. The silence of 1,200 people who didn't trust themselves to make a sound because they were afraid that any noise would break whatever spell had just been cast over that room. Then one person stood up, then 5, then 50. Then the entire auditorium was on its feet, and the applause was so loud and so sudden that the sound technician's equipment clipped, and for a moment the speakers crackled with distortion. Gerald stood at the microphone. He didn't bow. He didn't wave. He looked out at those 1,200 people, and for the first time all day his expression changed. His chin trembled. His eyes filled. He pressed his lips together hard, the way men of his generation did when they were trying not to fall apart in public. He nodded once, just once, Then he walked off stage. Backstage was chaos. Competitors who had spent months preparing, who had spent thousands on costumes and traveled hundreds of miles, were standing in the wings staring at each other. Ricky Valent, the two-time champion in his 3,000 crystal jumpsuit, was leaning against a wall with his arms crossed and a look on his face that one witness described as a man who just watched someone do something he knew he could never do. Ricky found Gerald in the changing area. Gerald was carefully folding his jumpsuit back into the plastic grocery bag. His hands were shaking. What Ricky Valent did next became the second most talked-about moment of the entire event. He walked up to Gerald, extended his hand, and said, "Brother, I've been doing this for 14 years. I thought I was good. I was wrong. You're the real thing." Then he withdrew from the competition. Just like that, the reigning champion, the prohibitive favorite, pulled himself out. When the organizers asked him why, he said, "Because it wouldn't be honest to stand on the same stage after what that man just did and pretend it's a contest." 3 other competitors withdrew after Ricky, not out of resentment, not out of protest, out of respect. They recognized that what Gerald had done wasn't a competitive performance, it was something closer to a communion. Gerald won the competition. He didn't just win, he received the highest score in the event's history. 2 of the 3 judges gave him perfect marks, something that had never happened before and, as of my last research, has never happened since. The local newspaper ran a small story the next day. The headline read, "Meridian Man Wins Elvis Tribute Contest." It was buried on page 6 of the entertainment section. No photo, 4 paragraphs, the kind of story that gets used to wrap fish. But the people who were there didn't need a newspaper to remember what they'd witnessed. Gerald Watkins went back to work at the textile plant on Monday morning. He fixed machines. He ate lunch in the break room. He drove home at 4 o'clock and had dinner with Claudette. He never competed again. Not because he was afraid of losing, not because he didn't enjoy it, but because, as he explained to a friend several years later, he'd accomplished what he needed to accomplish. He'd stood on a stage in the town where Elvis was born, wearing a costume that cost less than a tank of gas, and he'd let that voice out. The voice he'd been carrying and nurturing and perfecting in private for 47 years. He'd let people hear it, and they'd heard it. That was enough. He continued singing at his church. He occasionally sang at community events, picnics, fundraisers, retirement parties. He never charged a dime. He never made a business card. He never built a website. Word spread, though. Slowly, the way real things spread, not through algorithms and viral moments, but through people telling other people about something they experienced. "You need to hear this man sing." That sentence traveled through Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee, passed from mouth to mouth like a folk song itself. In 2004, someone offered Gerald a residency at a casino in Biloxi. Good money, steady work. He turned it down. "I'm not a performer," he told them. "I'm a man who sings." Claudette was asked once in 2008 if she ever regretted pushing Gerald into that competition. She laughed hard enough to startle the interviewer. "Regret it? That's the single best decision I ever made, and I include marrying the man in that calculation. Somebody needed to open that cage. The bird wasn't going to open it himself." Marcus Hall, the bandleader who had whispered "keep it simple" to his bass player, stayed in touch with Gerald for years afterward. He drove to Meridian once a year to have dinner with Gerald and Claudette. He brought his guitar. After dinner, they'd sit on the porch and play together, just the 2 of them. Gospel songs, mostly. Sometimes Elvis songs. Sometimes songs neither of them knew, songs they'd make up on the spot, 2 musicians listening to each other in the warm Mississippi dark. Marcus said those evenings were among the purest musical experiences of his life. "Gerald taught me something," Marcus told me. "He taught me that music doesn't need an audience to be real. It doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need a spotlight or a microphone or a single human being listening. Music is real because it exists." Gerald understood that in his bones. He sang because singing was what he was made for, not because anyone was watching. I've been thinking about why this story sticks with me, and I think I've figured it out. It's not because Gerald Watkins had a great voice. Lots of people have great voices. It's not because he won a competition nobody expected him to win. Underdog stories are a dime a dozen. It's because Gerald refused to let other people's expectations define what he was allowed to be. When he walked into that auditorium in his $37 costume, every person in that building made an instant judgment. They looked at the plastic rhinestones and the peeling belt buckle and the man who looked like somebody's uncle, and they decided they knew the whole story. They decided he was a punchline. We do this constantly, every single day. We look at people and we sort them into categories based on what we can see. We assess their clothes, their age, their confidence, their background, and we write a story about them in our heads, and then we treat that story like it's fact. But here's what 1,200 people in Tupelo, Mississippi learned on a summer afternoon in 2001. The story you write about someone in your head is almost never the whole story. It's usually not even close. Gerald Watkins carried 47 years of devotion in his voice. 47 years of listening, studying, practicing, understanding. He carried a love for Elvis Presley's music that was so deep and so genuine that it transformed his voice into something that transcended imitation and became its own kind of truth. You couldn't see any of that by looking at him. You could only hear it when he opened his mouth. And the people who laughed, the people who smirked, the people who looked at the program to see who was next, they almost missed it entirely. Almost. The cheap jumpsuit didn't matter. It never mattered. The only thing that mattered was what came out when he started to sing. And what came out was real. As real as anything that has ever happened on a stage in any city in any decade. Ricky Valent understood that. That's why he withdrew. Not because Gerald was a better competitor, but because Gerald wasn't competing at all. He was just singing. And when someone is just singing purely and honestly without performance or pretense or any desire to be anything other than what they are, competition becomes irrelevant. You don't compete with sincerity. You just stand back and let it breathe. I think we all know a Gerald Watkins. Maybe we know someone who's been hiding their gift because they don't think the world has room for it. Maybe we know someone who's been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't look the part, that they don't fit the mold, that they should leave the stage to the professionals. Or maybe we are Gerald Watkins. Maybe we've been carrying something for years, something real, something true, something that deserves to be heard, and we've been keeping it folded up in a plastic grocery bag because we're afraid of the laughter. If that's you, hear me, the laughter doesn't last. The laughter is always the first thing to disappear. It evaporates the instant truth shows up, every single time. Drop a comment below and tell me about your moment. The moment you silenced the room, or the moment you wish you'd had the courage to try, or tell me about the Claudette in your life, the person who saw what you couldn't see in yourself and refused to let you hide it any longer. And if this story hit you somewhere you weren't expecting, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that the costume doesn't matter, the resume doesn't matter, the pedigree doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what comes out when you finally open your mouth. Subscribe if you haven't already. I tell stories like this every week, stories about the moments that reveal who people really are when the surface gets stripped away. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Because the world is full of Gerald Watkinses, people carrying extraordinary things inside ordinary lives. People the world has already judged and dismissed and moved on from. People who, if you gave them a microphone and 3 minutes, would make you forget every assumption you ever made. Sometimes the most real thing in the room is the thing nobody expected. I'll see you in the next one.